Before we get into the conversation, I'd like to speak on behalf of our organization. Just very quickly, we are Chesapeake Legal Alliance. We are a nonprofit based in Annapolis, Maryland, and we provide free legal services to communities, to partner organizations throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed on behalf of a cleaner bay and cleaner water quality for our communities. My name is Will Hownan. I'm a staff attorney here at CLA. I'm also our outreach and engagement coordinator, and I will be moderating this event. Today's conversation is the first in a series that CLA is developing entitled Learning Land Use. Land use-based issues are some of the most frequent that we encounter at CLA in our requests for assistance. And the pressures of development and poor planning have great implications on local water quality and the overall health of the Chesapeake Bay. Our goals for this series include educating advocates and community members on the basics of land use law and its importance in watershed restoration and health. But the goal just for today is to introduce you all to some land use lawyers who might take some of the mystery, hopefully, out of the practice and encourage you to develop your own land use focus and hopefully utilize those skills to eventually take on a CLA land use matter. During the panel discussion, we encourage you to throw any questions you have into the chat. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can during the conversation, but we also will save 10 minutes towards the end to answer as many as we can. So without further ado, I would like to actually let our panelists introduce themselves. Panelists, could you please start with your name, your job title, whether you are currently a CLA volunteer attorney or volunteer in any way, shape, or form. And also let's do a fun icebreaker and what are you looking forward to most this summer? Becky, do you mind starting us off?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Becky Witt, and I am currently the assistant counsel to the Zoning Board in Baltimore City. So the board's called the Board of Municipal and Zoning Appeals. And so I've been in that role since January of this year. Before that, I was a staff attorney at Community Law Center, also in Baltimore City, where I represented small nonprofits, mostly community associations in the city, mostly. So I did a little bit of zoning work there because community groups would bring zoning cases to us. And so I had a little bit of a land use practice there. And also my first 2 years at Community Law Center, I was a pro bono program coordinator. So pro bono services are really near and dear to my heart. I'm not currently a volunteer with CLA. And what I'm looking forward to this summer, I think being by a body of water, whether that is a natural body of water or a pool, is what I'm looking forward to this summer.
Great. Ryan, do you mind going next?
Not at all. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ryan Kennedy. I'm the senior litigation associate at a firm that's based out of Leesburg, Dunlap, and in Ludwig. I do a lot of our real estate related litigation, commercial litigation out of our Tyson's office. I'm our resident Maryland litigator. In that capacity, I have a number of different kinds of land use cases, and I've previously been and currently am a volunteer with CLA, where I used to do a lot more land use several years ago, sort of pre-pandemic. That contracted a little as I made a career change. That's building up again now. So I do some pro bono land use now, but I also do it a little bit more than I used to as part of my regular job for retained clients. I apologize for my voice. Looking forward to the summer. I'm going to be down for a week at Kitty Hawk, and I've not had a full week off in some time, so that's going to be fun.
full week off is going to be great.
Yeah.
And last but not least, Andrea, do you mind going?
Sure. My name is Andrea LeWinter. I actually have my own law office, the law office of Andrea LeWinter, and I'm of counsel to Taylor Legal. It's actually Taylor Legal, not Taylor Law. But Catherine Taylor and I are kind of functionally partners in many ways. I've done land use law for about 15 years now. It's not my solo area of practice, but it's probably about 60 to 70%. And that encompasses a lot of administrative law through the counties, I usually do more smaller county stuff, but I have done some of the larger counties. I also am like an adjunct hearing examiner for Montgomery County, so I've done some adjudication for them. And I also do a lot of kind of neighbor to neighbor land use related disputes. So some of that is with homeowners associations, but a lot of it has to do with property rights. There's been many more issues involving stormwater, I think because we have such an increase due to environmental issues and flooding, et cetera. So I've done a lot of that. And I am not a volunteer yet. I hope maybe someday with CLA. I actually am doing a case with CLC, Becky's former organization, a case I inherited actually from Becky, where she did part 1 and I'm doing the appeal to part 2. So I've gotten to know Becky in a weird way, but she's a great attorney, and I appreciated reading the record that she prepared for her client below. This summer, I am looking forward to a rescheduled trip to Amsterdam with my husband and no children. So I'm hoping COVID does not get in the way of that again.
That's amazing. I also hope for your sake that doesn't happen. Great. So maybe we can stick with this panel rotation, Becky, Ryan, Andrea. But just to start us off, can you please describe your land use practice, how you started practicing land use, and how did you get to where you are now, basically?
Okay, I'm going first.
If you don't mind.
Sure. No, so I, in my current role, I thought I would kind of talk about both of my roles, my former role and my current role, because they are both land use related, but different and in a lot of ways. So currently I advise the zoning board for Baltimore City. So I prep all their files, flag any issues that I see, write a docket memo, laying out some of the issues that I see. And then after the hearings, I draft the resolutions for them to review and adopt later. So that's what I currently do, which I've been doing since January. In my prior job as an attorney who represented community associations in Baltimore, I would meet with communities to talk through their concerns about an upcoming project, give them advice about how to kind of frame their concerns within the context of land use laws and principles, because oftentimes I'd be working with groups of, it could be just a handful or it could be 100 people. And so it's hard sometimes to bring all of those different ideas and concerns and thoughts and use the zoning kind of framework to arrange them in this logical way that the board can then understand and apply. That requires a lot of meetings, a lot of talking, a lot of patience, a lot of phone calls, and so that is a lot of what I did in my previous job, helping them organize the case in a way that makes sense, gathering evidence, recruiting witnesses to testify, and then putting the hearing kind of case together. Again, that can really range in complexity between just a handful of concerned neighbors to many, many, many neighbors. I got started doing land use because I was working for Community Law Center, and we work with community groups of all kinds, small nonprofits who can't afford legal services. And a lot of our cases were kind of transactional or internal kind of structural cases, but occasionally people would come in and community groups would have an issue relating to zoning or alcohol regulation or whatever. And so a lot of my cases when I first got started related to liquor stores, because people had issues at the liquor board and we would go through that whole process, and then I would find a zoning issue. Sometimes in Baltimore City, if you abandon certain uses for a certain amount of time, they expire. And so sometimes liquor stores have been closed for a certain amount of time. If they're non-conforming, then that use goes away. And so kind of zoning was an alternative route to go. I know that's not related to environmental stuff or the Chesapeake, but that's kind of how I got into practicing land use. And then I've had a variety of different kinds of land use cases since then, just depending on what neighborhoods we're concerned about and brought to me. So yeah.
Still interesting though, just the start to where you are now.
Yeah.
Ryan, do you mind taking the next or this one, please?
Sure. It's funny, Becky, you're here with having worked with Community Law Center, because that's how I got my very first zoning cases. I took one off the list that circulates. Yeah, I'd always been interested in land use. I had a hard time after law school getting into it. And they always let you work if you work for free. So I just took one pro bono off the list, and I really worked it. I focused. I really worked it as hard as I could, and that snowballed. And that led to a connection with CLA. And over the course of a few years, I took a lot of land use cases from CLA. That was really the bulk of my land use practice, was CLA cases, all litigation stage or pre-litigation stage, community association representation. Well, so, some individuals that like was said, it ranges. There's a range of issues that come up. There are a lot of, how do we prevent this subdivision of this lot from occurring? How do we prevent a neighbor from, making constructing property within a stormwater easement, or things like that. And hearings before the Board of Zoning Appeals. Now, practicing with attorneys in Virginia, I have the opportunity to do some of the same work now in counties. I'm still involved in some cases in Anne Arundel County, but I have cases in Prince William, Loudoun, Fairfax County that I've dealt with as well. And some of the concepts are the same. They don't have the critical area law here, but they have something called an RPA. It's not quite as teethy as I would say, but it's still all, the work I do is still all litigation or pre-litigation when it comes to land use. I've never represented a developer, at least not willingly, and I find it to be very rewarding work. To me, land use is law you can touch. I like driving past the property where I had some hand in either keeping the trees up or making sure only some of the trees went down, and or maybe some trees got planted back in there. There's something very fundamental to me about land use law. There's lots of different things we get into as attorneys, but all of it occurs in the context of a community, and land use zoning in a way asked that this community even exists in the first place. And it's just something very impactful and fundamental about land use law to me. So I try to keep with it. It's been I'm on a little rant there, but
well, I was going to ask you if there was a particular matter that stands out, but it seems like you have a special relationship going by these properties, these conservation areas that you helped.
Yeah, I know sometimes I check on Google Maps to make sure the trees on that property in Jessup, they didn't die after 3 years. But yeah, it definitely is I could go on and on about how I feel about land use versus other areas of the law, and the level of impact that the sort of significance, the rewarding way it makes you feel to have that kind of impact on a community versus some other areas of the law. But that's my practice, and that's why I do it.
Great. Andrea, can you tell us a little bit about your backstory here?
Sure. I want to echo a little bit of what Ryan was saying. I kind of fell into it a little bit myself, but I had actually started out in child welfare cases, but then moved across the country and had small children and couldn't find a position that was going to let me kind of balance work and family in a way, but had always been very passionate kind of on a non-legal level on environmental issues, and kind of regretted not focusing more on that from an academic perspective, and didn't have an LLM in environmental stuff. And so when the opportunity arose to work with my partner and kind of mentor on land use, it really seemed kind of environmental law adjacent. The opportunity to really have an impact on some environmental issues that I cared about, even if it wasn't maybe as directly as I would have desired. And I've certainly found that to be the case. I've always been a bit of a cause-oriented person. I wanted to be working on something that I felt had more of a long-term impact. And so I was really appreciative when the opportunity arose. So I think I kind of lost my train of thought, but the other thing was that it went into practice for myself, and that enabled me to take those cases and balance work and family in a way that was more manageable for me.
Great. Fantastic answers. What was the hardest part about learning this field of practice, and how did you navigate that?
I think for me, this is kind of true about working with communities or groups of people generally, when you don't just have one client perspective, but you have a small collection of people. I think I've kind of already alluded to that. I mean, first of all, I think this is an area where an attorney's advice can be super, super helpful, because to me, land use is not necessarily intuitive for people who don't have a legal background. So people show up and they feel without an attorney and they feel very strongly about a particular issue, but they don't know what is relevant, or they don't know there's a handful of very important cases that you need to know in addition to looking in the code. And so they just don't know where to look for that. So I think a lot of the cases that I see, I mean, right now I'm the attorney to the board, so I'm sitting through all of the hearings for, our hearings are every 2 weeks. And so usually, almost always the community is not represented. And so those hearings are just hard to muddle through, because people really want to talk about one thing, but it's actually not relevant. And so if you can work with communities ahead of time to be like, okay, here's the situation, here's what the law says, and these are the things that we really need to focus on, it makes the hearing so much smoother. It makes people feel more heard, because they're talking about things that are important and not about things that are not important. So that has been the hardest part for me, is trying to learn how to communicate those concepts to everyday people. So I was just thinking of a couple examples. One that comes to mind is the community wanted to oppose a Burger King with a drive-through. And the Burger King itself was permitted by right, but the drive-through is conditional use. And so it really took a lot of discussion to kind of focus them in on opposing the elements that related to the drive-through and not talking about all the stuff relating to the Burger King itself, because that was permitted by right. And so if you start going into how, hamburgers are bad for you, blah, 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 that's not relevant to what the board is trying to discuss. So we had all those conversations before the hearing so that we didn't have to have them at the hearing. I think it saved them a lot of time. We ended up being successful on opposing the drive-through, and they ended up not building it at all because they didn't want to build a Burger King without a drive-through. So that's kind of an example of something that has been difficult to learn, and really does take a little bit of time to figure out.
Yeah, and I can speak from experience that kind of advocacy is so important. It's such a huge difference. Ryan, what was the hardest part about learning this field of practice for you, and how did you go about navigating it?
Yeah, similar. I mean, there's always the change in jargon, the new terms, new legal concepts. But as attorneys, we kind of have sort of guideposts of how to deal with those things, and that just being around other people who talk land use, or going and sitting. Before your first ever hearing, just going and sitting and listening to the hearing examiner, you pick up on these things. These things will come to you. To me, the most difficult part is especially for me, having sort of purely circuit court litigation background, a lot of family law, criminal defense, collections, things like that. You're used to this adversarial concept where, if nothing else, you just go in and you just be obnoxious and pound on the table and try to bludgeon the other side. And it's a different dynamic in a land use context, because there's more parties at play. At least I did a lot of work in Anne Arundel County. It moves slower. You don't have lawyers as judges necessarily on the other side of the table. It's just more. I don't want to say nuance, but it's just a different dynamic you have to learn to navigate that. That concept of, well, I'm here at a trial, I'm putting on a show, I say my piece, and now it's with God. That kind of you have to think about it differently than you would think about your traditional adversarial context, because there's also the county dealing with it. There's transactional administrative stuff going on in the background. You don't want to be, you can stand up at trial at a family law matter and say something and be wrong, and the judge just dismisses it. But if you're confidently incorrect in one of these administrative hearings, some of it could really have egg on your face, especially if the next day the zoning officer, or not the zoning officer, the planner, or whoever works with planning and zoning, comes up with a new document, changes a position. This is a flexible situation that you find yourself in. It's a different dynamic. So learning that was probably the most challenging thing.
Thank you, Ryan. Andrea, on to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I do think it's an area of law that's a little bit more nuanced. I don't mean to disparage any other area of law, but there are some pretty complicated concepts. And I think as an attorney, it does take a little bit of extra effort to master them. But also, I think, as Ryan was alluding to, you're often in front of an adjudicator who doesn't quite grasp them in the same way. And that can be frustrating because you're not quite sure, how much to explain to a judge. I mean, so many circuit court judges, their bread and butter is criminal and family, and you come forward with a land use matter and their head is about to explode. So knowing how to frame it, I still find that very difficult, because your audience is just not as set as you might expect. Because so much of this is driven by local county rules. Every time you're in a different county, you have kind of a whole new set to learn, and that can be overwhelming. And then each county seems to, in my experience, sometimes have its own jargon and its own way of interpreting things. And something you've read the rule 15 times, it seems clear as day to you, but the county, because you're new to the county, they all do it differently. So that can be tricky. And while I've found some great mentors, you do have to really seek people out. I've always found, even if I've kind of cold calling somebody in a different county, they're very helpful. But it is much more kind of solitary than if you're in family law or criminal law. And so you really do have to be assertive in terms of finding the resources that you need, which can be particularly difficult when you don't know what you don't know. Because I've certainly been in situations where I wish I had asked other questions before I got in the room, but I didn't know to ask them. So yeah, I mean, I like that challenge element of it, but it certainly has frustrating elements to it. And then the last thing I wanted to say is it's a very, very political area to practice in. And that can be incredibly frustrating because, as lawyers, I always tell my clients, just because you're right and just because it's not fair doesn't mean the law is going to be on your side. But that's kind of multiplied when you're in the land use arena because politics are really in the mix.
That's a great point to make. So both for our attorneys and laypersons in the crowd, in your opinion, what are the best ways to understand how zoning and land use decisions are made in a person's individual county? And what are the best practices for engaging with those local zoning officials, in your opinion?
So I can only speak for Baltimore City because, as I said before, everybody else got on, I have only ever practiced in Baltimore City, and I don't know how anything works in any other county. So the other attorneys will have to chime in with how things go. But so if you're just getting started and want to get a sense of how things go in Baltimore City, we put all of our zoning hearings on YouTube, so you can watch them. And I'm sure that would be a very educational process for people. If you have a particular thing that you want to see, you can look through the dockets that are posted on our website and see like, oh, they had, a drive-through conditional use, for example, and go watch the hearing and see how it was presented. So I think that would be where I would start if I didn't know anything, and just coming in fresh is to watch those hearings because, yeah, I think there is a lot you can learn there. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Ryan, I'll let you go next.
There's a book, I think it's called Guide to Maryland Zoning Cases or Guide to Maryland Land Use Cases. It's a blue book. It's about this thick. I don't think it's a West publication, so it might still be getting updated. But that was my Bible when I started started down taking land use cases. It's real. There are really good summaries in there. Go in and find cases you think it's all Court of Special Appeals, and well, there might be some circuit court opinions that are summarized in there, but it's a good starting point if you have a concept and you're not sure what to do. I must have read. I spent hours in the Anne Arundel County Law Library reading that book. It was
Ryan, would you repeat the name of the book for us, please?
It's it's hold on. It's Guide to Maryland. There it is. Guide to Maryland Zoning Decisions. It's a Lexis publication.
You have a bunch of CLA attorneys who are Googling right now, just so you know.
Guide to Maryland Zoning Decisions. It's a Lexis publication. It should be in most of your law libraries. I never bought a copy. I'd always just go to the law library and read it. But that was always a really good resource to start with. Because there were some, I'm trying to think of a good example. There was a race judicata. I remember a case I had where it was, some of these cases, part of why they're complicated is because they never end. You defeat the developer one time, they reapply, they move a bush from the left side to the right side, and they make a reapplication, and so you're back in. And I'm like, well, I'm familiar with the concept of res judicata, so let me just start flipping through this book. And I did. Well, sure enough, there's a similar sounding vehicle convention in land use law, and so that book helped me find that, and that's something I would recommend to anyone who wants to take a CLA case, is pop by your law library and see what that book has to say about the legal concepts there.
Yeah, thank you for us personally, as Evan put in the chat, we're adding that to our Xmas list. Andrea, after you.
So like I said, I've practiced in a lot of different counties, and there are certainly tremendous similarities, but there are some subtle differences. And reading the county charter, just flipping through the structure so that you can know kind of the hierarchy of administrative bodies that you're going to be in front of can be really helpful in terms of kind of understanding the lay of the land. I was sorry, my other thought kind of escaped me. Oh, but yeah, also just kind of because sometimes you're going, there might be other options, kind of side routes around. Like you might want to have your client actually propose like a zoning amendment and actually have the zoning law changed moving forward. So there are often workarounds if you can kind of familiarize yourself with how land use actually evolves in your particular county, because maybe something is prohibited right now or is allowed, but moving forward, you could get that changed. So I've worked with groups where, you know, a developer is proposing, you know, we have an large empty parcel, and the developer wants to put, you know, 100 units. And so while you're fighting that and kind of fighting their waiver applications on trees and all kinds of stuff, you're also going to the county council and saying, hey, what if we make a rule that, you know, you can't do this on this kind of property? And so I've had a couple of successes with that, where the developer turned around and you've kind of changed the rules behind their back. Maybe not so insidious, but there are kind of different prongs that you can look at if you are familiar with the breadth of how land use is done in the county.
Thank you, everyone. This was great advice from all of you. Moving on to our next question. It's multi-part. If you need me to repeat anything, please don't hesitate. So as a land use attorney, how important do you think it is to stay on top of upcoming proposed legislation? Are there any helpful resources to do so? And are there any upcoming acts to be on the lookout for as it relates to the Bay region during the 2023 session of the Maryland General Assembly? And I can repeat all of it if need be.
So from my perspective as the attorney to the zoning board, I feel sort of lucky in that any kind of legislative changes that are happening at the city are being flagged for our review of the zoning code. So we did go through a comprehensive rezoning in it lasted for like 5 years, but it was finally adopted, I think, in 2016 and went into effect in 2017. And that was at that point, obviously, I was a community law center attorney and had a lot to keep my eye on in terms of the complete rewrite of the zoning code. So from my perspective, a lot of the legislative changes that I'm looking at are from a city level, not so much from a state level. So I don't spend a ton of time keeping track of what's going on at the state level. So I'll leave that part of the question to my colleagues, I think.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep on top of that. I will admit I'm not presently up on too many of the changes that have occurred recently or that are pending right now in the General Assembly. So I don't have too much insight. I do things like I have Google alerts for Maryland zoning or different for Chesapeake Bay or things that I think will trigger Google to send me articles, and I check that. So that's sort of my way to keep on top of things. And I read the newsletters that all the various organizations send me. So that's my real resource. It's probably a little shameful as an attorney. I don't make more of an effort to say, hey, what law changed today? But it's certainly important, certainly.
Well, I do think it's refreshing to hear that you're not going crazy, staying on top of everything, but still engaging in these matters. So I think that's useful to hear.
And I guess I would echo that. I do feel embarrassed, but Ryan was nice enough to admit that too. I mean, again, because each county is so different, like I just find it kind of overwhelming to try and keep on top of everything. But you definitely, when a new issue comes before you, or just, you know, a new case, you want to make sure that you're up to date because there have been changes on both the local level. I mean, there's not as many on a state level I've found. It might be the current executive branch structure at the state level has meant that there's not that much happening, and maybe that will change if we have you know, a Democratic governor who's a little bit more involved on environmental issues. But it's the local level that seems to really be more impactful for the type of land use cases that I typically see. And Becky talked about comprehensive rezoning. That happens in every county every 10 years. They're all on a slightly different cycle, but that's a really important benchmark to look at. I mean, if you are practicing in this area and can really focus on one county, that's, I think you're really lucky because you have more of a closed universe. And I used to do just primarily Howard County. And then comp zoning was critical. Like you really had to stay on top of that entire process, not just because you typically had cases coming before the zoning board at that point, really the county council, but because there were impacts throughout the jurisdiction. So, you know, that's a really important time if you're in one county to really be paying attention to what's happening.
Thank you, Andrea. Again, as land use attorneys that are also concerned about the health and the water quality in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, do you have any thoughts about what more the legal community and or legislature should do to mitigate the environmental impacts of development projects?
So I'll take a crack at it. We'll see where I end up with this.
Okay.
Something that I have been noticing just as in my, I guess, 5 months here, is that there are, and Baltimore City is different from some of the county development too, because all of our development obviously is infill development. We're not kind of branching out into formerly undeveloped areas very much. I think something that we need to kind of take a look at is the extent to which our existing zoning codes might be not in the best interest of long-term environmental health and stability. So I guess what I've been thinking a lot about lately is mandatory parking minimums, which anytime you add a new unit in Baltimore City, you have to have an off-street parking space for that unit or a variance for that. And just this idea that we're presuming universal car ownership, and that every single person in a fairly dense city, we're assuming that they're coming with a car, or that they need to come to us for an exception to that car requirement, I think is problematic. I know that might be controversial, or there's different schools of thought on that, but I think it's interesting. People are having more conversations about parking requirements, about density limitations, thinking about kind of the long term and what's sustainable for how dense we need to be building housing so that we can have public transportation systems that work so that people don't have to have cars, kind of that kind of big picture. So yeah, I just wanted to raise that because sometimes I think we might come from the perspective that the zoning codes as they exist are protecting the environment, but some of our assumptions may be harmful to the environment, and the codes need to change and be updated with our current understanding of environmental impact of development.
Great, thank you, Becky. Ryan, I'll pass off to you.
So what was your question? Your off-script question here?
So, as a land use attorney that is also concerned about the health and water quality of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, do you have any thoughts about what more the legal community and or the legislature should do to mitigate the environmental impacts of development projects specifically?
Oh, okay, that's what I thought you asked.
Okay.
And I think that's some of that goes beyond my qualifications, because the answer is probably a lot more not just purely legal. You know, I've had the privilege of spending time sitting through meetings with water quality experts, civil engineers, people who design stormwater systems, and the answer is probably very multifaceted. I think my personal axe to grind is stormwater management problems. I've heard a local zoning official admit that adequate stormwater management systems really need to look more like terraforming projects, but in the same sense admit that he was not going to do anything about it or really take a hard line on demanding compliance with the existing law. So I'm sorry. Oops. Silence my office line.
Oh, we couldn't hear it. So
you couldn't hear it? Oh, okay. Yeah. So that's sort of one of the things that has been a frequent issue in the cases I've handled, is whether stormwater management measures are adequate. And though I am no expert in what they should be, there's consensus that the people I've worked with seem to have is that the way they're designed now in the Maryland manual, and even in other counties here in Virginia, it's just not, it's not enough. And then it really needs to be more of a gestalt, or some may even say a federal approach, because you plan a square foot of parking lot in McDonald's in New York, and you move the saltwater line in the Chesapeake Bay an inch. And I've heard that claim in a couple different forms. So yeah, that's something that I think needs attention. But I'm by no means an expert on that.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Andrea, would you like to take a crack at this question?
I'll try to, but I'm going to echo what Becky and Ryan said, that I think I see a small piece of this. I'm not in any way, shape, or form someone with a big picture expertise in this area. And I think both things Becky and Ryan said, I would again reiterate as really important. I do think our zoning codes are written from a very different perspective. And every time there's an update, I think more of these things get factored in, but they still have a very old mindset. And so I think focusing on the local could impact the Bay, because so many of the tributaries or whatever are feeding from all of our various counties. And if we had better protections in place at the local level, it would certainly impact the health of the Bay. As Ryan was saying, I think stormwater management is such a huge percentage of the cases that come knocking on my door, because people are having problems now that they're not built for the kind of flooding. I live in Howard County. We had Ellicott City, multiple floods, and that's endemic in our county. It's endemic in my backyard, and people don't quite know what to do with that. And so I do think looking at a local perspective, not just a state perspective, if that's something that CLA or pro bono attorneys have the capacity to do could really have an impact. Even things like, I was thinking of kind of neighbor to neighbor cases that I've had, but like I had a homeowner who wanted to plant or had planted a pollinator garden, but it was against the covenants of her community. You were supposed to have a lawn. And so they wanted to force her to mow down. I mean, her yard was beautiful. It wasn't not well maintained, but it wasn't conforming to our current expectations or prior expectations of what a yard would look like. So even making allowances that homeowners associations couldn't have requirements like that, the same way they can't limit the number of political signs that you have in your yard. You know, why should they be allowed to limit whether you can have a pollinator garden, things like that. People who are objecting to having their neighborhood sprayed by pesticides, which all run into the bay. And again, have things within their covenants that require that kind of spraying. So people are encountering some of these things, and now that they have greater environmental awareness, are finding that the existing laws require them to maintain a regime that's just not tenable anymore. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just a reminder, as we move on to our final question, if there's anyone in attendance who has a question for our question period, feel free to drop that in the chat section. But yeah, last question for you all from me. What advice do you have for attorneys who want to get into and practice land use? Could be as specific or broad as you want it to be.
I guess I would echo things that my fellow panelists have said. Definitely taking a pro bono case is always a nice way to get your feet wet a little bit in a new topic or a new area. And I would just really encourage people to try it and see if they like it. What I really like about it is that it's so, I think Ryan was talking about this earlier, it's so site specific. You get to research something that is so specific and so tangible, like the history of a property, which can be really interesting, the history of a neighborhood and how people have interacted with each other over the years. And because all my work has been in Baltimore City and I live in Baltimore City, I get to kind of drive around and kind of see all the different cases that I've had over my 10 years practicing. So it is, I think we've spent a lot of time talking about some of the difficulties and kind of the uniqueness of it, but I do think it's a great way to get your feet wet in administrative hearings and in an area that is just very, you can really put your hands on. So highly recommend it.
And I highly agree. Ryan, what advice do you have?
About the same advice. I couldn't think of a better way to get involved. If you've never done a land use case before and you want to see what it's like, take one from CLA, take a pro bono one from any organization. I like CLA because you all have been very supportive of me, and if not, been a resource, connected me with a resource so I could talk through a problem with somebody. There are other experienced land use attorneys out there who either aren't volunteering right now or are retired and doing consulting, and they're more than happy to talk an issue through with you. So just take a case, dive in, don't be afraid to ask for help.
Thanks, Ryan. We appreciate that shout out. Andrea, what advice do you have?
I'm just going to repeat, I think, what everybody else said. But I do want to stress that I do think it's really important work. I do think you can have an impact and on your, as Becky was saying, on the place where you actually live. And that can be really powerful. Sometimes you can have these small victories that actually add up to something. Kind of, you can kind of lose the battle and win the war. Kind of like she was saying with her, the Burger King that went away because they couldn't have the drive-through lane. I've certainly had cases like that. And I think it's really interesting law. Like it continues to be interesting, even though I've been doing it for 15 years. Like, I feel like I'm always learning something new. It's an evolving area. So and there's a real need. I think Ryan said he's done only opposition work. I've done primarily opposition work. And like, for example, I don't do it anymore in Howard County because I'm conflicted out. And I get calls all the time. People are desperate for people to help them with these kinds of issues, to help them to go up against big developers that have tons of resources. So there's a real need.
Great, thank you, Andrea. And thank you, panelists. I don't see any questions from the audience currently, unless Molly, have you seen anything that I didn't catch?
I have not seen any questions from the audience yet in the chat. I do want to point out that both Sarah and Evan have dropped some really interesting resources into the chat that I would encourage everyone to check out before they leave. And I actually have a question for our panelists. We have at least 2, if not more, current law students attending this conversation. And I'm wondering if you have any advice specifically for law students. Is there anything that they can do during their law school career to better set them up to make it an easier transition into practicing land use law after law school?
I have a couple thoughts because I've been thinking back to my land use class that I took in law school. And it's just, I think this is kind of general advice that applies to law school in general, law students in general, is that you learn the rules in law school, and it seems as though they're so bright line and so obvious, and that it'll be real easy to go out into the world and you'll know what the outcome will be. I remember learning about variances and my professor being like, this is what a variance is. They're so hard to get. You have to go through all these steps, and no one ever gets a variance because the standard is so high. And the standard is high, but people still get variances. So I think you need to kind of take that information and then go see how it's applied. And I think it would be very illuminating and interesting for you to do that. Anyway, that's just something I've been thinking about in the past few months, especially thinking back to that class and how differently the standards are actually applied when you have people in front of you with a real problem, and it becomes less abstract.
I was there not too long ago, so that rings very true for me. How about you, Ryan?
It's certainly, if you're in law school, you're not able to just go out and pick up a pro bono case. So, there's still, I know when I was in law school, I was a law clerk to a firm that did, in Howard County, that did land use. That helped me gain an understanding of some of the concepts, not a lot, but some of the concepts. It exposed me to those attorneys. So I'd encourage you to try to make those kind of connections while you're still in law school with people who know, because once you're out, you're not, it's like it was alluded to, there's more that you don't know than you are aware of. And the case, is a little selection bias. The cases that actually end up come to you because they're messed up and they're complicated. It's David versus Goliath, so it's not going to be the open up the horn book and there's the rule, problem solved. So when you're fresh out of law school, you're not really equipped to just go taking really any kind of case, I would say, on your own. And you need a mentor. You need someone who you've built a connection with while you were in law school. I know I had one. I probably could have leaned on it a little more than I did, but I would encourage you to do that. Make network. Go to the Land Use Institute. If they let you, I don't know. Go take classes on it. My law school didn't have a clinic on it, but if there was a clinic on it, do that. those kind of things.
I know the University of Maryland Environmental Law Clinic occasionally has a zoning case, so I would recommend that if you have that option.
Great, thanks, Becky. Andrea, do you have any advice for law students who might be interested?
Sorry. The only thing I would add, I think Ryan and Becky's advice is great, would be to take an admin law class if you have one and you haven't taken one, because so much of what you're doing is administrative law. So that I think could be really informative. Yeah, I guess that's all I would add. That's not repetitive.
That's yeah, it's tough to go last after everybody's made these great points. Okay, well, again, I don't see any more questions, and it looks like we've hit about an hour now. So I would just like to thank everyone again for attending. Thank you, panelists, for providing this wonderful information. If you do have a question later on, feel free to contact us. I believe our information is on the screen here, either me, William at ChesapeakeLegal.org, or Molly. And yes, we hope you attend the next of our series and enjoy your afternoon and the rest of the week. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.